Okay, welcome to the 7th talk in our 2022 speaker series on the ethics of argumentation. Today we have a speaker who actually wrote an article entitled The Ethics of Argumentation. So obviously he had to give a talk. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Hugh Breakey, who's the Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow in Moral Philosophy at Griffith University Institute for Ethics in Government and Law. And as I just mentioned, he has written an article that is literally entitled The Ethics of Argumentation. So he definitely has something to say about it. And one that I almost like more, but only almost, about meta-argumentation and the ethics of meta-argumentation, both of which I really, really love. And so today he's going to talk to us about a topic that was started, or that is very closely related to the first talk in 22, when Trudy Gouvier was talking about the coercive impact that arguing can have, and whether that means that we have to ask for consent or not. So here today we're going to hear about whether rational manipulation is permissible or not. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Katerina and Andrew, for the invitation to speak. It's great to be able to link in with all you guys. It's 3 in the morning in Australia here, so if at any time I'm less than cogent, it's probably well, I'm going to blame that as being the result. But it's terrific, and I'm very glad to be able to share this with you. I think it's a fascinating topic. And I think it's one that surprises me a little. It's one of those things where you start working through the arguments and you find yourself perhaps landing in a slightly different position from the one with which you began. And it is something where I'm sort of still thinking through exactly how this works. So I'll be really keen to hear from all of you in the Q&A. To see if there's something going on here I've missed, or if there's more things that I should be addressing or doing so in different ways. So the topic is rational manipulation permissible? I'll be talking about a particular phenomena that I think can occur in some types of arguments, especially when we're having them face to face, especially when we're having them in real time with an interlocutor. But can also arise potentially in more sort of monological situations when we're writing an op-ed for a paper or something like that, and we have in mind a particular audience, and we're wondering about the ways that they might react to what we're saying, and the ways that we might curate the information for them in a way that might lead them to a correct conclusion. So this is what it's going to look like. The next, hopefully a little less than an hour. I'll be talking you through these 4 areas. I want to define what rational manipulation is and clarify a few things that it isn't. I want to talk through why I think rational manipulation might be wrongful. We'll draw on some long time arguments that have been out there in the sort of ethics for argument space, and suggest that they apply relatively straightforwardly, to cases of rational manipulation. And we're looking at some contextual factors because we don't live in an ideal world where we have limitless amounts of freedom and time to make arguments. And also there are role factors, particularly the role of advocacy will be significant in what I'll have to say. And then I'll look at counter arguments. I'll put forward 2 counter arguments that I don't think are compelling. But then I'll put forward one that I think we need to take very seriously, and so my thought will be that we need to nuance the conclusion and understand that there are cases where rational manipulation might be appropriate on the basis of one major counter argument. So here's the condition. Rational manipulation, as I understand it, is constituted by the following conditions. Alf aims to persuade Betty of some thesis X. Alf holds that the thesis he's trying to persuade Betty to believe is both true and it's rationally justifiable. Alf knows of the existence of argument or information or evidence or pictures or documents or lines of thought or ideas or conjectures. Why? Well, why is not itself misinformation? Why is not factually correct? If it's an argument, it's not demonstrably illogical. But even though why isn't wrongful in that sense, A suspects B might take Y as being important evidence for not X. So Y is the type of information that could lead someone, it might be sort of like a red herring. It leads someone in a direction away from forming a proper conclusion about the issue, and therefore it can be taken as evidence to believe the thesis not X. A then, Alf elects not to mention Y to Betty out of a concern that it could mislead Betty into believing not X. And I will suggest that in cases like that, Alf has rationally manipulated Betty. Here's an example so we can think about a concrete case. So Alf and Betty are very topically discussing the ethics of abortion. Alf knows there are certain facts about fetal development that, if Betty knew, she would likely to take as being reason to be wary about Alf's strong pro-choice position. Alf deliberately avoids making Betty aware of those facts in their discussion. So that's a case. I don't think it's fanciful to think that cases like this arise. I think it's possible that many of us might have been in a situation that's somewhat analogous to this in our lives when we talk to people. And in such a case, we're thinking today about, excuse me, has Alf acted wrongly? Does Betty have any legitimate grievance if she later realizes that Alf treated her in this way? If she realizes that Alf knew this information and knew the effect it would probably have on Betty, and he deliberately avoided letting her know this information, but he did so because he thought that it would mislead Betty and that Betty would wind up making a poor epistemic judgment and she would wind up getting something wrong. Has Alf acted wrongly? I'll take it that that's an archetypal example of rational manipulation. But as we go on, I will talk about at least one other case where I think it's what looks like rational manipulation happening, but it's more forgivable in that case. But this I take to be an archetypal instance. Why do I call this rational manipulation? Well, I take it that Alf's behavior is rational in at least two senses. First, Alf aims to rationally persuade Betty to believe the thesis. So he's engaged in argumentation. He's in the business of putting forward ideas and premises and evidence that logically link together by the standards of informal argument and informal logic to give Betty reasons to rationally believe the thesis. He's not trying to persuade Betty to believe the thesis on the basis of any other ways, like creating an art form or triggering her emotional responses, for example. So it's rational in that sense. It's also rational in the sense that Alf believes that the thesis he's urging upon Betty is both true and is rationally justified. He thinks that if somebody was a highly rational person, a conscientious thinker, was fully informed about all of the facts of the matter, that person would come to believe that the thesis X was true. And so in that sense, what he's urging upon Betty is rational. So it's rational in those two senses, but at the same time, it looks like it prima facie falls under a definition of manipulation. We just look up manipulation in a dictionary. It's going to say things like this. It's going to say manipulation means to control or play upon by artful, unfair, or insidious means, especially to one's own advantage. It is to manage or utilize something or someone skillfully. It seems to me that Alf's behavior falls straightforwardly under both of those two categories. Now, whether he does so in an unfair way is something that we'll explore as we go forward here. So in that sense, we'll need to wait upon seeing the final justification for that. But it certainly looks like he is controlling Betty in an artful or insidious way, in the sense that what's going on here is insidious. It's happening beneath Betty's conscious awareness. She absolutely doesn't know what is happening. But it also seems to be artful. It seems to be utilizing skillfully. He's doing something very clever. He's looking at the way that he understands Betty as reasoning, as thinking, and he's curating the knowledge that he gives Betty in a way to lead her to believe what he wants her to believe. And he's doing so in a way that doesn't involve him direct lying. He's not bludgeoning Betty or pressuring her into believing something. He's doing something in a much more skillful and artful way, not lying, not doing any of those things, but nevertheless curating the information she has in an insidious way to lead her to something that he wants her to believe. And so in those senses, I think it looks plausible to say that what's going on here might well be manipulation. It's both rational and it's manipulation. So I'm calling it rational manipulation. So let's move into section 2. Why might rational manipulation be morally wrong? Why should we be concerned, if we should, about what Alf is doing to Betty? Well, what seems to be going wrong here is that Alf is disrespecting Betty's autonomy. And there's a whole bunch of ways throughout the sort of history of ethics of argument, ethics of persuasion, where we might see the principles that are at work here being reflected. So let's start with Keller and Brown, 1968. If A reacts in such a way as to inhibit the self-determination forces within the other, his communication can be considered less ethical. It seems pretty reasonable that that might be what's going on here. Certainly A is doing things in a way that are weakening Betty's self-determination rather than leaving it up to her. He's instead doing things in a way that leave the judgment very much in his hands and not in Betty's hands. Brockreed, 1972, very, very famous and evocative analogy between argumentation and sex. Talks about the ways that argumentation can be a type of rape, but also talks about how it can be a type of seduction. In his thinking, the seducer A tries to eliminate or limit his co-arguer's most distinctively human power, the right to choose with an understanding of the consequences and implications of the available options. And again, seems plausible here that this type of seduction is what's going on in rational manipulation. It's a type of trickery, and it's a type of trickery that's aimed to overthrow Betty's right to choose with an understanding of the consequences and implications of the available options. She doesn't understand fully all the consequences. She perhaps doesn't understand the available options. She certainly doesn't have in hand all of what she would see as being the relevant information. And she doesn't have that because A has aimed to explicitly eliminate or limit her access to that. Johannesson in 1979, in a related context, talks about the way that a person might violate an implied agreement with another. He's speaking particularly in the context of an expert who is providing information. But it looks like that is also something that might be at work here. One of the reasons we might be wary of what Alpha's done is because Betty wouldn't agree to it or hasn't agreed to it. And finally, and Katerina noted my work in 2019 on the ethics of arguing. And in that paper, I put forward, based on a whole bunch of earlier argument theories, including all the people I've just cited. I put forward a notion of shared deliberation, which is sort of a high standards argumentation interaction between two people. And then I go on to give a bunch of principled reasons, leaning especially on people like Kant, to say that the norms of shared deliberation are not merely epistemic, but are also ethical. We actually treat our interlocutor in an ethical way, based both on strict duties and strict negative duties, but also positive and imperfect duties. And my thought there is that there's a bunch of these principles that look like they're imperiled or violated by what Alf is doing, and especially the linchpin acceptance that others are ultimately entitled to come to their own conclusions. Looks like Alf is absolutely breaching that. He's not letting Betty be entitled to come to her own conclusions. He's decided what conclusions Betty should come to, and he's feeding her the information, the true information to be sure, but nevertheless, he's feeding her the information that will make sure she comes to the correct conclusion, and she doesn't get distracted by something that she might think is relevant, but which Al thinks will mislead her. So are all of these, and this is the thing I've been wrestling with over the last little while, are all of these versions of the same thing? Is it the same notion of autonomy and rationality and respect that's at work in all of these? I think there are closely nestled ideas here, and I think it's worth us splitting them apart. So I submit there are three ways why rational manipulation, especially in our archetypal case that we've already that I've already been over, three specific ways that rational manipulation disrespects autonomy. And often these things will all be closely nestled together. Often to violate one is in fact to violate all three. And I think that is the case in the original case that I put forward, the original archetypal example of rational manipulation. But it will get complex, and it will get complex because I think there are other cases of rational manipulation where these start pulling apart, and that's where things, I think, become ambiguous and challenging to think through the ethics of it. Okay, so let's talk through those three ways in which rational manipulation can disrespect autonomy. So number one is the question of consent. It looks like Alf is interacting with Betty without her consent and in a manner to which she could not be expected to consent. And the concern with consent looks straightforward for most cases of rational manipulation, simply because Alf can't get her to consent to this, because if he does, he's sort of giving up the game. If he says something explicitly to her and he says, look, there is some things going on here that I know about, but look, I'm just not willing to tell you about them because I think you would be distracted by them, and I think they would be misleading for you. So I'm just not gonna not mention those facts in order to make sure that we have a good discussion and we come to the right conclusion here. It looks really implausible that Alf's going to be able to say that. He's going to want to be able to say that because it simply looks like it's self-defeating. The whole point of his rational manipulation is to ensure that Betty doesn't find these other facts. And certainly I think it just looks plausible to me that the moment you mention that to somebody, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try and jump on Google or something similar and try and work out what this information is that someone is explicitly keeping submerged so that they draw you to the right conclusion. So it looks like there are major issues of consent here. And I should also just stipulate, although we can take it up in the Q&A, but I take it that A and B are having some type of interaction here, or that at least A is doing something positive and then he's considering, how should I treat Betty in this argument? So what's not at work here is that A and B have no interaction. There's no communication between them. And then A is considering, do I have a positive obligation, apropos of nothing, to inform B about stuff? I take it that's a very, very different question, right? So the question that we're doing here, I take to be central to ethics of arguing, like that's the context we're in. It's not the context of just information provision. We're not talking about whether or not Alf should suddenly jump in and alert Betty to things that it looks like she doesn't know for various reasons. We're talking about a case where A is already committed to communication, he's already committed to argumentation, and then he's wondering what his duties are in terms of sort of frankness or full disclosure should be in this context. So that's the concern with consent. The next one is a type of respect for rationality. It looks in what he's doing as if Alf is putting his rationality above Betty's. He doesn't respect her as a reasons responsive agent in her own right. He also seems to be presuming infallibility in the sense that presumably if he's taken to task for what he's done, if it's exposed, his main line of justification will be that he's right, that he's correct in his view about his thesis X, and that therefore he would be doing Betty some type of wrong or misleading her if he were to show her evidence that she's likely to take as being conclusive for not X, or even as highly relevant for believing not X. So he's presuming that he's infallible, or he's presuming that at least he has an extremely high chance that his view here is right, because that's the justification he's relying on for misleading Betty in this way, or at least for not being fully frank with Betty in this way. So he's presuming infallibility in that sense. He's also presuming infallibility in the sense that he's quarantining his view from B's rational interrogation. If he was being upfront about all of the things he knows, pro and con his thesis X, then it might be that Betty, sure, she might take some of that evidence in a way that misleads her. It might lead her into a sort of cognitive bias or a sort of epistemic trap. But at the same time, it might be that Betty can take that information that he's disclosed, frankly, about the sort of information that can be relevant, and she might add to it something that she knows, a line of argument that she can create, or some other evidence from her other experiences or knowledge or expertise, that then actually allows her to form a genuine argument against X, an argument that perhaps Alf should be listening to and heeding. But by not being frank and not be sort of fully disclosing everything that's that he and Betty might think are relevant to the issue, he's quarantining his view from B's rational interrogation. And that looks like one way of not respecting her rationality. It's also the case that in terms of respect for rationality, Alf's creating a worrying epistemic state in B. I haven't got a really good handle on this, but it seems to me there's some concern here. Betty might believe something is correct, but it seems right to say she doesn't understand it. She doesn't know all of the pros and cons in this case, and she doesn't understand it in that fashion precisely because Alf has made a decision that he will keep things from her that she thinks are relevant, and therefore she can't know all of that pro and con. Alf has created the knowledge in Betty, or perhaps the belief in a true fact would be a better way of expressing it, but he hasn't created understanding in her because he hasn't fully furnished her with all of the things that might be relevant from her perspective. So the worry in general here is a respect for rationality, and it is one of those things that it seems right to say when we respect others' reasons, and this is very strong in someone like Kant, when we respect others' capabilities for thinking, when we treat them seriously, when we try not to manipulate them, but instead to understand that other people are reasons responsive, and that they, as much as us, can think through issues, they can respond to evidence, they can respond to argument, and they can help us think through evidence and argument as well. We, in a deep way, treat them as being a human being. We respond to something that is very important in their own lives and in our lives. And of course, I think it goes without saying here that that when we fail to respect that rationality, we often are really setting ourselves up for morally worrying stuff. One of the sort of hallmark ways in which you can do bad things to people is by starting out with the belief that they will not respond to reasons, that they cannot be reasoned with, that all they understand is force, or they're ideologically gulled. All of those types of things are things that can set the stage for disrespecting other people. So I think there's common sense reasons for thinking that Kant was right in thinking that we really have special duties to respond to others as being rational and reasonable agents. So that's the second one, respect for rationality. I think it's different from the respect for self-determination, which is the third one here. And in this one, we're not focusing so much on the idea that Betty is a rational thinker in the way that Alf is, that she has the same types of capabilities and the abilities to make arguments and to listen and respond. Instead, we're not talking about the quality, so to speak, of Betty's reasoning. We're talking about its ethical role. The role of Betty's reason, the proper role of it, is to deliver her decisions and judgments. That's what her reason is in the business of doing. That's what it's for. It's for her. It's to look after her life. It's to allow her to be responsible for the decisions and judgments that she makes. in, say, Lockean phrasing, we might say, is what allows her to shift for herself, to be a self-governing, self-determining agent. And that's what she has a mind for. Her mind is to make her own decisions and her own judgments. It is not to be merely a passive receptor for more clever and intelligent people like Alf takes himself to be, to come up with decisions and judgments for her. So the worry here is that Alf is usurping that role. He's improperly making up B's mind for her. And even if Betty, in this case, might make a wrong decision, it's still, in this sense, it seems it's her decision to make. And Alf is going wrong morally because he's decided it's not for her decision to make. The fact that she will make a wrong decision in this is such a strong consideration that Alf decides he will make up Betty's mind for her. He will decide what she should judge, and he will manipulate the evidence he gives to her to ensure that she comes to the right conclusion, not that she comes to her own conclusion about this. So I take it all three of those things are at work in the principles that I put up on the previous slide by those various thinkers. And it looks to me like all of these things are at work in the concern we raised earlier about the archetypal example that I put forward earlier. However, as we will see later, I think these things do pull apart in other cases. And so we'll get to cases where it looks like respect for rationality might pull apart from respect for self-determination. And that's when I think things get philosophically and perhaps morally challenging for Alf. So let's move now. They are, I take it, the reasons why rational manipulation, if it's wrong, is wrong on the basis of those three autonomy respecting bases. Let's now move to consider some contextual factors. Are there cases in which Alf can say, yeah, look, guilty as charged, I did all of those things, but here's why I think it is justifiable or it's excusable, or at least the wrongfulness has been mitigated because of the context that I was in. So first one might be cases where Alf's communication is monological and his audience is general. So Alf is putting a speech up on YouTube, or he's writing an op-ed. It's not a dialogue. It's not where he and Betty specifically are engaged in an argument. Instead, the argument is taking place in a sort of much more abstracted form. Alf is simply putting forward the reasons that he has in his manuscript, in his paper, and the audience that will be reading them will be a general one. There'll be people like Betty, but there'll be people like Hugh and Kat and Andrew and everyone. And in this case, it looks like Alf has something reasonable to say here. He can say, look, it's impossible for me to reasonably address all the ideas that every audience member might find relevant. And so if it is the case that I have left out something that I know that probably some people would find as being relevant, that should be excused in this case, because I wasn't catering specifically to them. I was catering to all people in general. And I think this looks okay so far as it goes. It does seem to me that if there are cases where Alf knows that there will be a significant cohort of his readers or auditors who might be swayed by certain type of evidence, and he's going to deliberately withhold that evidence, I still think he's falling under morally wrongful rational manipulation. But at the same time, there can be cases where those concerns are such a niche issue that it seems reasonable, given Alf's understanding of his audience, that he wouldn't bother to engage with them simply because he's making a more widely applicable argument. So I think that this is an excusing factor in certainly at least some cases, but I don't think it gives him carte blanche, even if his communication is entirely monological. And the audience quite general. I think if there is something that is bound to arise and that Alf clearly knows many of his audience would take seriously as a relevant reason, and he deliberately fails to mention it because it doesn't press in the direction that he wants the audience to go, I still think he would be guilty of rational manipulation. So that's context number one. Context number two, Alf's communication is significantly constrained in time or length. So if Alf has got 5 minutes to explain to Betty why she should accept the thesis X or what he sees as being the relevant things for thesis X, well, in 5 minutes, it may well be that Alf can't cover all of the points even in favor of his own position. He might be having to leave stuff out that he thinks is important and relevant and actually leading towards the correct conclusion. So if he can't even cover the stuff he wants to say in favor of his position, it seems too much to say that he should instead be spending some of that time mentioning evidence that's actually contrary to the thesis that he's trying to urge upon Betty. So that seems fair enough. And it also seems that even if we imagine, okay, A could have just mentioned, he could have just said, okay, look, there's some stuff out here that perhaps you should take up in your own time, but I'm not going to explore it in any detail. It seems that if he doesn't have the time, not merely to address it, to mention it, but also to address his reasons against this red herring's evidentiary status. So if he merely mentions that there's this evidence out there, but he doesn't have the time to talk through with Betty, look, here are the reasons why I think you should be wary about this evidence. Here is the reason why I think you should be really cautious in thinking that this is compelling evidence. If he doesn't have that sort of time, then it can seem like not only is Alf sort of handicapping himself when he mentions this stuff to Betty, but it might even appear to Betty that he's endorsing that information as being relevant. He's only just sort of raising it as an issue in his quick 5-minute presentation. And so Betty might think, contrary to fact, that Alf actually thinks this is important evidence that she should be taking on board because he's mentioning it and he doesn't have the time to engage more deeply with it. So again, this seems to be a plausible thing to say, that this is a reason why, even if Alf does go through the rational manipulation line of thought, he deliberately suppresses something because he thinks it will lead Betty to an erroneous epistemic position. It still seems like he's justifiable in this context because it does look like that if he can't put forward his most basic reasons, if he doesn't have time to address the concerns he has with why, both of those look like reasonable things for him to say that allow him to do what he's done. At the same time, of course, I don't think this is a compelling reason in every context where Alf might be time limited. If Alf and Betty are having an argument, it goes on for half an hour, let's say, and he hasn't mentioned something on the basis of rational manipulation strategies, it really looks to me like Betty has a legitimate complaint against him. He can't really say in that case, look, I didn't have time to cover it. It seems that there was obviously a dialogue, there was obviously things going back and forth, or he had a significant amount of time to expound the things that Betty could have seen as being relevant, and he chose not to do so. So again, I think that there are cases where this will excuse rational manipulation, but at the same time, I think we'd be wary of thinking it applies in all instances where there is simply some constraint on Alf's time or length of communication. The next one gets interesting. The next one is about role expectations and advocacy. Let's imagine now that Alf isn't just a bloke off the street. He's actually a formal advocate for X in some sense. Let's say he's a representative politician who has been elected on the grounds of this thesis that he took to the electorate. And so he's representing, in a sense, all of the people that believe this. Or perhaps he's a spokesperson for a company, that's his job, or he's a lawyer, say particularly a lawyer in an adversarial judicial system, where he is defending his client or he is prosecuting a defendant, and it is absolutely his job in order to make this argument and to advocate for the thesis that he's trying to get Betty, perhaps a voter, perhaps a jury member, to believe. Well, what's changed in this one? Well, what's changed is that Alf now has positive role obligations to argue for his thesis. There is now, he's not merely arguing and pressing it upon Betty because he thinks it's correct. it's actually his place in a larger system to do so, and other people are relying upon him to do so. Because ALF has those positive role obligations, and because they should be very visible to everyone, Betty should understand and expect A's advocacy. A isn't hiding his agenda in this case. Betty should know he has an agenda, and that he's engaging with her purely on the basis of trying to persuade her about that. His agenda is not hidden and subversive and insidious. It is front and center. And so that should at least mitigate Betty's concerns about consent. She should understand that this is what ALF is doing, and if she's not comfortable with that type of interaction under those conditions, then she should be excusing herself in some way from the argument or from the larger process that is happening. And finally, the formal system that she's in, the classic one here would be a political system, whether opposition parties, or an adversarial legal system in which there is a lawyer who is expressly tasked with pressing the opposing thesis. So the formal system should include other advocates arguing for opposing positions. And therefore, if there is information out there along the lines of the type of thing that ALF isn't going to mention to Betty, there's somebody else whose job probably is to be finding that stuff out and pressing it upon Betty. And so in cases in cases of formal advocacy where these conditions are in play, it does seem to me that many of the major concerns we've got with the major autonomy-based concerns we've got with rational manipulation look like they aren't compelling in this case. The issue of consent is surely much clearer in this case. B should expect what ALF is doing. At the same time, Betty is being left to make up her own mind and make her own decision. She hears everything from A that he has to say in favor of the thesis. She hears everything that C, Kathy, has to say in favor of the opposing thesis. And then she's put in the position of being able to come to her own judgment. And as well, there isn't information that's being left out. The information should be being made present to her. And so she can make her best rational decision on the basis of the full gamut of the information. So in all of those ways, it looks like when ALF is a formal advocate for that thesis, concerns with rational manipulation don't arise. So I take it that that's correct, but even if this excuses formal advocates' rational manipulation, I think there's a bunch of worrying cases where we have less formal advocates, like somebody who's an op-ed writer who's consistently on theme, let's say in a venue, in a newspaper, for example, that has a clear ideological position. So she writes for a right-wing paper, or she writes for a left-wing one. In that case, can it be said that she has all of these, that her role obligation is to press her left-wing or right-wing thesis, and that therefore everybody should understand, well, of course that's what she's doing. She's not going to mention stuff that we might, as a reader, that we might take on board and actually wind up believing the opposite. She's entitled to press her case and not to mention other stuff. I'm much more wary about that context. Another context would be, what about a doctor urging the health benefits of a treatment to a patient, especially in cases where the doctor knows that the patient might easily be misled by various types of biases and mistakes, cognitive errors, and therefore might not get the best patient treatment that's available to them and is in their best interest from a health perspective. In all of those cases, I'm much more wary. I actually think that rational manipulation, perhaps not in a full throttle sense, but certainly in some sense, is at work and could be wrongful in those contexts. And also, before I move on, I'll just briefly note that even when the ALF has positive role obligations to argue for his thesis, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of the other information that Betty might take to be relevant is going to be out there. Let's imagine an example case where ALF is the spokesperson for an aquaculture, offshore aquaculture industry. And one of the things with aquaculture is that a lot of it happens that's invisible to normal people. And he might have information, environmental information, even video footage of various types of pollution that are occurring. What now is his obligation when he gets up and he makes arguments to say, let's suppose he believes the sustainability of what he's doing, but he deliberately suppresses this information that Betty cannot get in any other way, because it is only Alf and Alf's company that actually holds that evidence. Again, now I'm worrying that some of the concerns with rational manipulation come into play. Alf does have positive role obligations to argue for his company in this context, but at the same time, I think there is manipulation going on because Betty simply cannot access in any way or from any other advocate someone urging the opposing position. Okay, let's move now to counter arguments. We'll go through these first two quickly because it's the third one that I think is the tricky one. So perhaps Betty's responsible for her own beliefs. On her head be it, says Alf. There's nothing stopping her getting more information from other sources, so it's okay for me to leave out this stuff. Well, true, Betty is responsible for her own beliefs, and there's nothing stopping her getting more information from other sources, but she doesn't know what she doesn't know. Alf has given her no indication his arguments cannot be taken at face value, and that therefore Betty should be in a position to make a judgment call about the issue by the time they've finished their argument. She doesn't know what Alf is deliberately suppressing, and so I think it seems wrong of Alf to be able to rely on the fact that Betty can then go off and search in her own ways for more information. Counter argument number two. Look, and there's a good paper by, I think, Schreier in 1930 saying, look, there's lots of non-rational ways that Alf might sway Betty to various beliefs, and these are widely accepted. Notions of flattery, of charm, of having pleasant music and ambience playing in the shop where he's trying to sell her stuff. All of these things are non-rational ways that Alf can get Betty to come around to his view. And we allow most of them and think that most of them are okay. Well, why shouldn't rational manipulation be treated similarly? So for the record, I think Schreier is absolutely right when he says, look, we should judge argument, we should judge rhetoric by the same standards we judge everything else. It's not a special case. If manipulation or propaganda or non-rational persuasion is allowed in other contexts, it seems fair to say that it should be allowed in rhetorical contexts as well. That seems plausible for me. It seems consistent. The thing that I worry about, though, with rational manipulation is it manipulates the rational process itself. In lots of other contexts, when we know we're being charmed and flattered by the other person, we can still understand that that's happening. We can still make an effort to step back from our emotions and to make an objective judgment. In this context, Betty can't make an effort to step back from what's going on and just consider the matter objectively, because it's precisely her rational thinking that Alf is manipulating. So he's not coming at her in a non-rational way where she can get rational about things. It's precisely her rationality that he is curating in order to lead her to his chosen destination. So I think there is a way we can say that in this case, rational manipulation is worrying in a way that non-rational methods of persuasion aren't worrying. Let's just turn now to a new example. What about when people are, well, stupid? And I've got up in bold type there that nice quote from the movie Men in Black, where Kay has just revealed to Jay, look, aliens have been wandering around on Earth for a long time now, but we keep it secret from everyone. And Jay says, well, why the big secret here? People are smart, they can handle it. And Kay responds, a person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it. And this seems plausible in that context. It does seem like this is the type of thing, the fact that there are actually aliens on our planet and aliens out there in the world, that is the type of thing we could all get together and be really stupid about and get really, really worried about. And so it seems that Kay has said something pretty legitimate here about why they are not allowing ordinary people to have this information that they definitely, I think it's fair to say, would like to have and perhaps think that they should have. So let's use this now to fashion a new example. Kathy and Dinesh, let's say, are discussing the trustworthiness of vaccine. Now, Kathy knows that if she mentions the true fact that some people have conspiracy theories about shadowy cabals nefariously orchestrating vaccine development, that Dinesh will think this provides important evidence in favor of the possibility of a conspiracy. Kathy knows that Dinesh is the type of bloke, well, he thinks where there's smoke, there's probably fire. He would therefore be wary about Kathy's strong pro-vaccine position, and Kathy deliberately avoids making Dinesh aware of those facts in her discussion. Now, I think on the definition I've given, Kathy rationally manipulates Dinesh. But is this wrongful? Is it wrongful for Kathy not to mention facts that look like they are absolutely going to lead Dinesh up the garden path, given his propensity for sloppy epistemic thinking and sort of just conspiratorial attitudes that he has? So the tricky bit here is that we mentioned previously the respect for rationality, but rationality is a substantive standard. It actually puts forward demands that people need to live up to, and people can fail, and they can fail spectacularly in reaching those standards. How can we ask ALF to respect someone's rationality in a context where they're going to demonstrably fail to employ it, as it seems plausible to say that Dinesh might be in the scenario we've just put forward? So suppose this evidence he's suppressing, suppose Y can only be seen as probative on the basis of reasoning that ALF has strong rational and evidentiary basis for thinking is straightforwardly fallacious, and this alleged fallaciousness is well known to both A and B. So suppose we're dealing with a context where ALF has every reason to believe the type of conspiratorial thinking that Dinesh is prone to is really fallacious. That there are just very strong rational reasons for thinking that this is not a good way of organizing your beliefs. And suppose that alleged fallaciousness is well known to both the interlocutors. So Dinesh knows that there is widespread skepticism about conspiratorial type thinking out there in the world. Well, in that case, we might say, look, A has a strong respect for rationality reason to avoid discussing Y. It violates A's epistemic standards in this context to pander to B's rational failings. Surely it can't be a type of respect for rationality that obligates ALF to mention stuff that is just demonstrably silly in order to cater for B's silliness in this respect. And as well as conspiratorial beliefs, we might even think here of prejudicial beliefs, beliefs that somebody might have about, Betty might be prone to thinking bad things about people who come from a particular religion, for example. Is ALF really meant to mention those types of facts when he's engaging with Betty? That doesn't seem right. So in this context, it looks like respect for rationality and even ALF respecting B's rationality is going to lead him to avoid mentioning this information that just looks like it's manifestly irrational and will simply be pandering to B's irrationality if he mentions it. At the same time, Betty has more awareness that X is the type of information that I've said he here because I'm jumping back and forth between Kathy and Dinesh and ALF and Betty, so my apologies for that. But in this case, let's say Dinesh should have more awareness that X is the type of information that he should not expect that Kathy will relate to him. And if he knows that at the outset, if he knows, look, Kathy doesn't believe in conspiracies, Kathy thinks it's crazy to organize your beliefs on the basis of prejudice against religious worldviews, or let's say she thinks that astrology is nuts, and so she isn't going to mention the star sign of somebody she's talking about, even if she knows that Dinesh thinks that's all relevant. But if Dinesh knows all of that stuff about Kathy's epistemic standards and the types of rationality that she's willing to respect, then he can expect that she's not going to mention those types of things. And if that's true, if he knows that going into the interaction, then our concerns with consent are less of an issue. So what I think is going on that's sort of philosophically really interesting here is that those three types of rationality we put up before that all nestled together very elegantly in some contexts, it seems to me they're pulling apart in this context. It seems to me that, that the respect for rationality is now pushing against disclosing this information, and the concerns for consent are no longer operative in this case as well. So provided that that Betty has these types of expectations. But it's still the case, I think, that Alf isn't letting Betty make up her own mind about these things. So that final standard still seems to me to be operative in this case, which means that these considerations are now pulling in different directions. So there are worries here. One of the worries with Alf here is he's likely to overestimate his own rationality, right? Everyone does this. Everyone tends to think that informed people who don't agree with them are irrational. And there's lots of reasons we do that. We do it because we are subject to confirmation bias. We're subject to groupthink. We're subject to self-efficacy bias that makes us think we have above average rationality. All of those things could drive Alf to take too much latitude in engaging in rational manipulation. That is, the worry is that on the basis of the things we've talked about on the previous slide, Alf will be too freewheeling, too free and easy in rationally manipulating Betty because he's able to convince himself that everybody who disagrees with him is in fact rationally confused, and therefore he's entitled to make allowances for that when he's making discussions with other people. So that's a worry. But the other worry is still that self-determination, autonomy, respect thing that I mentioned earlier. Even if Alf is rightly disrespecting Betty's flagrant irrationality, there's still a concern with Betty's autonomy qua self-determination. Unlike respect for reason, this does not turn on standards, how good a thinker is Betty, but on roles. What is the purpose that Betty's thinking should be bent towards? That is running her own life and making her own judgments. So can Alf avoid usurping the role of her reason by focusing on standards and not on outcomes? This is something I'm flirting with as perhaps an answer here. He's not interested in pressing the conclusion onto Betty when he does this. He's not suppressing it on the basis of that he wants her to believe the true thesis X. Instead, he's focusing on means, not on ends. He's focusing on the types of standards that he will hold himself and her to during argumentation. So he's saying something like this: look, I don't care what you wind up believing. It's your job, and I respect that it's your job to come to your own judgment. But at the same time, I will not discuss with you concerns that, as it seemed to me, only appear as relevant on the basis of patent fallacies. So what I'm thinking here is that Alf can be justified in doing what he's doing if, rather than focusing on the importance of bringing Betty into a particular state of belief, he's saying, look, there are some things that I won't discuss with you, not on the basis of where they might lead you, but on the basis of the fact that I think as actions, as sort of epistemic belief revision processes, there are standards that these things would be failing to uphold. It would be rationally poor of me to engage with you unless we could do it in a very long and serious and conscientious way. Things like your prejudicial beliefs, things like conspiracy theories, things like your strange articles of faith that come from your faith, because those things to me don't seem to be rationally coherent. I'm not going to argue with them about them. If you think they're important, that's fine, but you can find someone else to argue with about them. I'm not in the business of pandering towards what I take to be your potentially serious ways of revising your beliefs. So I think that is a one possible way that at this point we can say Alf would be justified in doing what he's doing to Betty. He's not doing it for reason of making sure she comes to the right conclusion, but on the basis of upholding certain standards of rationality that seem to him to be legitimate. But as I say, my thinking here is a little bit fluid. So I do change my mind and emphasis on these points here. So I'm absolutely interested in hearing what everyone will have to say. And I'll be getting to Q&A very quickly. We're almost at the end. So there is an issue here, even if Alf does make all of those claims towards Betty, and therefore he thinks it's okay to behave in this way. From Betty's perspective, an interlocutor who's unlike A, who takes Betty's concerns seriously, encourages them to do their own research and decide for themselves, they will seem to accord them deeper respect. And they will be true that when those people get together with Betty, they're really genuinely thinking together. They're putting everything onto the table and saying, let's work this through. And that's something that Alf is not willing to do. So there is a type of respect that B can get from other people. And unfortunately, those other people might be people who also reason very poorly, like she does, ex hypothesi. So there is this worry that we have that even though Alf is doing something justifiable, Betty will get a more full-throated respect from other areas and will therefore perhaps gravitate towards them. And I think this carries the consequence that people with very poor or strange belief revision practices might be more likely to experience the world, experience mass media, news, mainstream politicians as being manipulative, because these are all deliberately avoiding engaging with information that these people are known to think is relevant. So they don't mention stuff that might be relevant to you if you believe in a conspiracy theory. And it would be easy when they consistently don't do that, when they consistently fail to mention the possible presence of the Illuminati and what's going on. It would be easy to move from that towards thinking that there is this wider level of manipulation going on, where everybody is sort of being forced into thinking this particular thing. So let me conclude. I've argued that outside the context of formal advocacy roles, during a discussion, it is a serious ethical matter to deliberately withhold information from another person that you believe they would mistakenly find relevant and probative on the matter. However, in cases where there is insufficient time to explain why the information is irrelevant, or perhaps also in cases where its supposed relevance would directly violate well-established epistemic standards, these ethical concerns with rational manipulation are at least to some extent mitigated, even if they may not be entirely neutralized. So I suggest that whenever we're in a position to curate someone's informational environment, it's important for us to focus not only on what will help them come to what we perceive as being the right answer and avoiding misinformation along the way, it's also important to ensure that we avoid rational manipulation and the way it can disrespect others' autonomy. All righty, thank you all for listening in, and I'm keen to hear everything we have to say. I'll stop share now.